Doyle. Professor Doyle, I understand, has just come from an international flight. He actually looks great, I must say, and very refreshed and ready to go. But we particularly are pleased to welcome you to our campus and to extend our gratitude for you sharing your ideas with us this evening. I'm also pleased to welcome all of our students who are with us. I think I am always particularly pleased to see students from many disciplines. We rode the elevator with students from international studies. I know there are students here from law. My guess is there are students from many parts of the campus, so I'm delighted with that. I see faculty colleagues from around the institution, very pleased about that, and I know we see faculty colleagues and leaders from Westminster. President, we're pleased to have you here with us this evening. Members of the community, I see familiar faces, and I'm very pleased to have you join us this evening. Thank you all for taking the time to be part of this dialogue this evening, and thanks for your interest in the University of Utah. For the past 4 years here at the University of Utah, we've been very focused on addressing what we sometimes call grand challenges, big societal issues of our time. We have done that with a program called Transformative Excellence, the idea being to bring people together from very divergent disciplines to address big issues in new ways. The goal being bringing people with different ways of thinking, different methodologies, different expertise, different ideas, different strategies to try to bring real solutions to some of the most urgent problems of our time. I think it may be that kind of approach and those ideas are the very best way to really address issues, to improve quality of life, to move things forward in ways, particularly in intractable problems. I think it would be safe to say that the issues discussed tonight are among those type of grand challenges issues, very, very relevant work for all of us. I think we are well aware of the vulnerability of migrants, of refugees, of our dreamers, our DACA students here on campus, and of so many as they face vulnerability, gaps in protection and movement across borders. As a city and a university that welcomes refugees and serves refugees in the institution, we in Salt Lake are keenly aware of these challenges and really excited about the opportunity to think about better ways through policy, through partnerships, through collaborations, that we can create a better world and a better system for us all. I'm very pleased as I look around this room to see faculty colleagues from economics, political science, sociology, law, a variety of places around campus. I think together you can do much. I'm hoping for a lively dialogue. The stakes are pretty high. This is an important issue. So I wish you all a productive discussion, and thank you for being with us this evening.
Thank you, Dr. Watkins. My name is Michael Poppich. I'm the director of the lecture series named after O.C. Tanner and Sterling McMurran. This is the 26th lecture, began in 1989 with the inaugural lecture by Martin Marty from the University of Chicago, and has continued almost uninterrupted for the past 27 years. In the past few years, we've had Renee Girard, Michael Walzer, Diana Eck, Rosemary Radford-Ruther, Sayla Ben Habib last year, and this year, Michael Doyle, who will be introduced by my colleague, Dr. Chatterjee. And the lecture series is founded as a way to promote public discourse, which was very nicely described by Sandra Watkins as this kind of occasion. Sterling McMurran told me a story about how O.C. Tanner got the idea for these lecture series, including the Tanner lecture series on human values. Apparently he served a mission back in the 20s in Germany. And in doing so, he, going from various town to town, had encountered these public lectures sponsored in Germany. And it sort of stayed with him that it would be great to sponsor that sort of thing as part of the United States cultural opportunities. And so this lecture series grew out of that original experience of O.C. Tanner when he served his LDS mission in the 1920s. So at any rate, I welcome you to tonight's lecture by Dr. Michael Doyle. My colleague, Dr. Dean Chatterjee, will introduce. Thank you.
Hello, welcome you all. I'm Dean Chatterjee here in the College of Law. And first of all, I would like to thank President Watkins for being here and doing the welcoming note. We are grateful for that. This year's Tanner McMurray Lecture is jointly sponsored by Westminster College and the College of Law here at the EU. I thank President of Westminster College, Stephen Morgan, who is sitting right here, and the Dean of our Law College, Robert Adler, in sponsoring this event. Both President Morgan and Dean Adler, they're sitting right over here. I acknowledge you, and I thank you for that. And of course, I thank Professor Michael Poppich, who is the director of the Tanner McMurray Lectures. I must also mention some others in the Law College here who have helped us so much in putting together this evening's program: Baiba Hicks, Chris Monty, Dana Wilson, Jonil White, and Margaret White. Thank you all. Now about our distinguished speaker, Professor Michael Doyle. Professor Michael Doyle is the director of Columbia Global Policy Initiative and University Professor at Columbia University in the School of International and Public Affairs, Columbia Law School, and the Department of Political Science. Earlier, he has taught at the University of Warwick, that's in the UK, Johns Hopkins University, Princeton University, and Yale Law School. He holds a BA, an MA, and a PhD from Harvard University. Professor Doyle's major publications include Ways of War and Peace, The Question of Intervention, which is his latest from Yale. By the way, both these two books should be there up for book signing after the event over here. By the way, also the reception and the drinks and food and drinks, they will also be there waiting for you in case you didn't have enough to drink, enough to eat, during the book signing. You can take advantage of that too, okay? And he has so many other important path-breaking publications like Empires, Making War and Building Peace, and Striking First, Preemption and Prevention in International Conflict. That was his Tanner Lecture in Human Values at Princeton University. In 2001 through 2003, Professor Doyle served as the United Nations Assistant Secretary General for Policy and Planning and Special Advisor to Secretary General Kofi Annan, where his responsibilities included strategic planning, where, of course, part of that was Millennium Development Goals, the famous 15-year program to eradicate poverty, and also relations with Washington, and also in the international corporate sector, where the Global Compact, that was there too. From 2006 to 2013, he served as the chair of the UN Democracy Fund, and he currently chairs the International Peace Institute. Among Professor Doyle's many honors and awards, let me mention just these three. There's too many of them to list all of them. In 2001, Professor Doyle was elected a Fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. That's, of course, a big national honor. In 2012, he was inducted into the American Academy of Political and Social Science. He is also a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, that's in New York City, as you know. On a personal note, if I may, since 2006, Professor Doyle has been on the editorial advisory board of my book series, Studies in Global Justice, of which I am the series editor. This is not his honor, this is my honor, and I wanted to acknowledge that. Okay? Professor Doyle will speak this evening on Professor Doyle will speak this evening on Migrants and Refugees, a new model treaty for international mobility. As you know, the lecture topic cuts across many interrelated areas: war, peace, climate change, poverty, human trafficking, political upheaval, and terrorism, to name just a few. By the way, in our law college, as well as on our big campus here, so many faculty and students there, so much involved in probing all these issues and doing work in these areas where they have been trying to help folks from all over the world. And so it's especially important that we got this speaker and this talk scheduled here on this campus. Westminster College too, that's a famously active, committed campus into not only learning, but also into social change. Now, as the world's leading scholar diplomat, Professor Michael Doyle has probed in all these areas that I just mentioned, the importance of the topic and the prominence of the speaker. The importance of the topic and the prominence of the speaker. I hope I don't look as bad as Chuck Schumer in his glasses. I think I better take it down. The importance of the topic and the prominence of the speaker will combine to make the talk this evening a great experience for us. So with that, I invite Professor Doyle to give his talk here. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that wonderful introduction. I'm truly honored to deliver this Westminster Tanner McMurran lecture for all sorts of reasons. Mr. Tanner has done so much to advance scholarship engaged with the world in the series that he's done, and I'm very pleased to be a part of that here. I'm also very pleased to have this kind introduction from Professor Watkins, Professor Popich, and especially from Dean Chatterjee, my friend. Dean's own work in global justice has had very large influence across the world. But frankly, one of the things that's most unusual and striking about his career is his talents as an entrepreneur of scholarship. That is, he has brought more people together to do more interesting work than just about any colleague I can think in the field. So your own work is great, Dean. Your entrepreneurship in terms of real scholarship is really quite extraordinary. So on those reasons and many others, I'm really delighted to be here. It's a real privilege. My topic is the crisis in the international regimes for migration and refugees, and the need for what I call a new model international mobility convention. This is a convention that's been negotiated by 30 plus academics and experts around the world. At the end of my presentation this evening, we're going to pass out a summary of that convention so you could get a fuller flavor of what's in it. And attached to that summary is an invitation to everyone here to consider looking at that summary, glancing again at the treaty, and if you were so minded, to please sign it. We're looking for support from all of those who find the principles and practices outlined in that treaty attractive, because someday we hope to improve the basic regimes for migration and refugees and mobility across countries. So the invitation will come at the very end. My talk this evening is 3 steps. First, I want to talk about some of the current challenges of the migration and refugee crisis. I think some of this will be familiar to those here in this room, so I won't dwell upon it. The second thing I'd like to talk about are the limitations in the 2 global treaties that regulate migration and refugees, the 1951 Convention on Refugees with the 67 Protocol and the 1990 Migrant Workers Convention. And I'm going to talk about some of the problems in these treaties and the need for eventually a revision of them. And our model treaty attempts to make some revisions, and I'll explain what they are. And then I want to conclude with some brief comments on the scope of the treaty, because I'd like to emphasize that, the model convention. The methodology, again, just a quick mention. A bit more time, I want to talk about the compliance problem, which is severe in these kinds of human rights-oriented treaties. And then wrap up with a couple comments on what is our moonshot? What are the 30 plus commissioners dreaming about when we worked on this document. So let's start with the current challenges. There are about 250 million migrants by the UN definition of a migrant. That's someone living outside their country of birth or habitual residence for at least a year. If we think of this as a nation, it's slightly less populous than Indonesia, a little more populous than Brazil. So we're talking about a lot of people in the world. But they're actually a small part of mobility, which is what really interests the authors of this treaty. There are, at the same time, 1.2 billion tourists per year. That's someone who leaves to go on a tour. So 5 times the number of established migrants move every year as tourists. Yet there's no regime for tourists. Although the number of migrants have grown pretty strikingly in the past 15 or so years, in a longer perspective, this is not something strikingly new. The numbers of migrants, that is, those who are living in a country for at least a year, has ranged between 2 and 4% for the past 40 or 50 years. This is not greatly different from that. And when we think about human beings more generally, we are a species that, even though we mostly stay put, that's the 96%, we've been moving throughout our whole history. Human beings began when our ancestors moved out of southern Africa. Some of them then went west, another group went east, crossed what later became the Red Sea, and populated the globe. We are a species that have moved, so it's not so unusual. Today, about 2/3 of international migrants live in Europe, Asia, North America, in that order. Most immigrants come from India, Mexico, Russia, China, Bangladesh, roughly in that order. We all know they make crucial contributions to productivity and innovation around the world. For the skeptics out there, I'd be happy to throw some figures at you in the Q&A. So that's the good news. Unfortunately, many migrants and some citizens of the countries that they have gone to feel that there's a loss of control over borders. This is something that particularly affects the governments of destination countries and some of the citizens in those countries. You only need to look at the politics of the United States, of Austria, of Britain, of many other countries to see this new mood, and that's a serious problem. Another problem is for the undocumented immigrants themselves. Because they're undocumented, they're subject to very considerable exploitation. I used to work in the UN, and when I looked out my window, I looked out over Queens, and Queens, very nice borough of New York, hidden within it in basements all over Queens are sweatshops that exploit laborers largely because they're undocumented. So that's some of the downside. But much more unfortunately in the world today is that the human mobility also includes 22 million refugees and 3 million more asylum seekers seeking refugee status. Over half of the world's refugees are 18 or under. It means that unless they get an education now, we're talking about a lost generation, and that's a severe challenge. They've been driven by their homes from civil wars, for example. And 2014 saw the largest increase in the numbers of displaced, both internally displaced and refugees, in a single year. Nearly double the numbers seen in the previous decade, a level not seen since World War II, when great movements, of course, took place in the aftermath and the defeat of Nazi Germany. And these numbers continue to climb in 2015. It's when the refugees, the asylum seekers, showed up in Europe that the word crisis was first attached to the word of refugees, not before then. But there were large numbers, and they were surprising. The numbers dropped slightly in 2016, but not very much. And they may not have dropped after we begin to count in the 900,000 Rohingya who have recently, in the past few months, shown up in Bangladesh. Confounding the problems I've described so far, the numbers of refugees returning home, that is, eventually being able to go back home, is at a 30-year low. Put this together with my last statistic I'm going to throw out at you. 84% of those who are refugees are being hosted in developing countries. Predominantly, think of them, Lebanon, Jordan, Turkey, Pakistan, Iran, Ethiopia, Kenya, now Bangladesh. And the typical displacement there lasts 20 years. 80% of the money globally that's spent for refugees is spent in rich countries, Germany, Sweden, the US, England, elsewhere. But 84% of the refugees live in the poor countries. Remember that 80-80. There's a radical discrepancy. It's not sustainable. Something much better needs to be done. There needs to be better funding. There needs to be resettlement. The UN tackled this on the 19th and 20th of December 2016. The international community gathered in two summits, one organized by President Obama called the Leaders Summit. And it was a wonderfully American pay-to-play event. That is, in order for you to come as a head of state and speak, you had to pledge either money or resettlement. It was a very good event. Many of the pledges have not been fulfilled, and the pledges that have been least fulfilled were the ones that President Obama made on behalf of the United States, where he promised to increase resettlement levels to 115,000 a year in the U.S., and in the past couple of weeks it's been lowered to 40,000, as you may be aware. The day before, on September 19th, UN officials and UN diplomats gathered in a summit hosted there, and they reaffirmed the principles of the protection for refugees and the value of safe, orderly, and regular migration. These principles were affirmed, and that was a good event. But honestly, at the UN event where those principles were affirmed, they basically just kicked the can down the road, to be unkind to the hard work that went into that summit. That is, they postponed most of the hard decisions to 2018, in which they promised to do two global compacts, one for migration, to outline the terms of safe, orderly, and regular migration, a very large challenge under the leadership of Louise Arbour, a wonderful jurist and a Supreme Court jurist from Canada who was also the Human Rights Commissioner of the UN for many years. She's working to organize that in cooperation with Mexico and Switzerland. And then the other compact will be a compact on refugees being led by UNHCR, again trying to provide a bit more meat and bones to the broad principles of refugee protection, which they reiterated in 2016. These are big promises, and they'll need leadership, and they'll need inspiration. Whether they'll get it or not is a big, big question. But even if it does come forward, we're also going to need a new set of standards that will cover the full phenomena of mobility, of people moving across borders, and repair some of the limitations in the two framework treaties, the one for refugees and the one for migrants. And that's what this commission of 30-plus academics and experts did over a 2-year period. We were supported by the Soros Foundation generously, not in terms of money, but they gave to us a room that was about half the size of this one. But the thing that was wonderful about it is completely surrounded by big screens so that you could do video conferencing in ways that made it feel like the people were in the room. So we saved a whole lot of airfare over our negotiations. And we spent 2 years putting together this model convention, which I'll show you at the end. And it was the big motivation was to address the flaws in the 51 Convention on Refugees and the 1990 Convention on Migrant Workers. Let me say up front that the 51 Convention is a landmark in human rights. It's a testament to coming to terms, too late perhaps, with the horrors of the Holocaust by providing rights of refuge for those who can make it to another country. So it's a human rights monument. It's a wonderful treaty. But nonetheless, there are serious gaps in it and some flaws, which I'm just going to describe in a moment. And the Migrant Workers Treaty I can't be so enthusiastic about it. It's good there is a treaty, but it definitely also needs improvement. So how do we improve? Why do we need to improve each treaty? Let's start with refugees. The problem at the very heart of the Refugee Convention's problems is a narrow definition of the grounds for protection, which are limited to individuals who have been persecuted on the basis of race, religion, nationality, social group, or political opinion. That's still good, granted. I don't want to undermine that in any way. But what does it say to us about equal threats to life stemming from starvation, severe drought, floods affecting an entire country, generalized violence, or civil wars? It says very little about that. Now, at the regional level, Latin Americans in the Cartagena Declaration and Africans in the African Union Charter expand the coverage of the elements that will allow you to make a claim to asylum to some of these other concerns. But none of them take into account climate change, and that's an emerging threat that someday will be driving people out of their homes and risking their lives in the process of doing so. And it's not covered in the 51 Convention. The second achievement of the 51 Convention is that you have a right to non-refoulement. That is, that if you make it into another country and you can make a credible claim of persecution based upon the elements I've mentioned, you can't be thrown back out if you can make that claim. But there's nothing in the 51 Convention about the right to arrive. If you can get in, you can't be thrown out, but there's no right to arrive. So that's another problem. Once you gain protected status under the 51 Convention, you have rights that you can claim equivalent to other aliens. That is, the rights that that country happens to grant to aliens, which is good, but not fully adequate. We tried to address these problems in the Model Convention. First of all, we broadened the grounds for asylum to include any external threat to your life, whatever the cause. A threat to your life, a threat of torture, or a threat of arbitrary imprisonment. If you're threatened in that way, you're a forced migrant, and you can make claims equivalent to that of what a 1951 Convention refugee can make. The second is that we change the rights that you can claim from the rights that are equivalent to that whatever are granted to an alien to rights that are equivalent to whatever can be granted to a citizen, which means that you can get your kids into school right away. It means that you can become employed right away and begin to recreate a viable life and make a contribution to the country that's providing you asylum. And lastly, we specify that there is a right to enter, and this is probably the most radical thing in this part of the convention, but only under very narrow circumstances. You have to be able to show that your life is at risk. You have to be pre-certified by UNHCR in order to make this claim. And something we call the responsibility sharing mechanism has to be in place, which allows and requires countries to pledge the funds that are adequate to provide support to refugees wherever they are, and a certain number of places for resettlement to take the 10% that can't survive in countries of first refuge and resettle them in others. So you need to be coming directly from a country in which you're threatened. You need to be certified by UNHCR, and the resettlement and funding mechanism of responsibility sharing, which we describe in the treaty, has to be in place. Once those three things are in place, then you have a duty under this treaty to allow a refugee to come into your country and see if he or she can make an adequate claim to either forced migrant or refugee status. So that's what we do to try to cure some of the problems in the 51 Convention. What about the migrants, that is, those who are not being driven from their country, but are going for labor and other purposes? Well, the 1990 Migrant Workers Convention had a number of good things in it. It established rights of unionization, that is, to join unions, if unions exist. Equal pay to nationals if you're in the same job, so you can't discriminate on pay to two workers doing exactly the same thing. You've got access to the legal process. There are many good things in the 1990 Migrant Workers Convention. But significantly, there are no ratifications of the 1990 Convention by any country of destination. And notice that the purpose of the treaty is to protect labor migrants going to another country. So basically, the treaty is totally ineffective. So what are some of the problems? Well, one problem has to do with temporary migrants. The Convention of 1990 creates too many rights and too few rights for temporary migrants. It creates too many because even the temporary migrants get the same kinds of rights as a permanent migrant gets when they come to work in a country, including access to all different levels of education on equivalent terms to nationals, access to social housing, if there is social housing. And all of that means that countries of destination are much more reluctant to take temporary migrants because they're afraid of how much they will cost. And so there are a lot of jobs that don't get filled that could be filled to the benefit of the workers who would be coming to do them, the countries in which they had been working, and the home countries to whom remittances would take place. Needless to say, also involved with circular migration, that these individuals would have an opportunity to go back to their home, bringing talents and capital, which can make a positive difference. So there are too many rights to temporary migrants, meaning that there are fewer of them that are brought into countries. But there are also too few rights for temporary migrants. In order for the temporary migrant to have the kind of respected rights that are necessary for the kind of life that they want to lead, they need multiple visas, not just one, so that they could go home and visit their family, because their family typically does not come with them. They also need to be able to take home whatever pension rights they've earned during their temporary migration and use those at home, all of their various payments that they've made. So we need portable pensions. And then lastly, there needs to be a time frame so that no one would ever become a permanent temporary migrant. There would be a time frame under which they would have to be graduated to a migrant with full equal status to the workers within that country. So that's a problem. The other problem is that there's nothing in the Migrant Workers Treaty that talks about tourists. There's nothing that talks about students who move across borders and the rights that they may need, or visitors who are just coming to a country for a business meeting. There's no legal framework underneath all of these billions of people who are moving across borders. So there's some serious problems attached to that. The overall aim of the treaty, a summary of which I'll pass out at the end, is to establish a floor, not a ceiling, for the rights of migrants, refugees, and forced migrants. It's a minimum framework on which countries are invited to build if they want to, as, for example, the Europeans have done. Everyone has a right to leave a country. No one has a right to enter a country until this treaty provides for those special circumstances for refugees and forced migrants, unless at a regional level there's a choice to do so. The Europeans, under Article 45 of the Treaty of the European Union, provided free movement back and forth. But this is designed to be a floor. We're not going to create global free movement, not open borders, but it's designed to create a more regulated regime whereby countries of destination, countries of origin, the migrants themselves will benefit from a better framework of law. Let's now turn to some special features of this new model International Mobility Convention. The first and most striking one is its comprehensiveness. That is, this will be the first time that there will be one treaty structure that covers everyone from a visitor, anybody outside their national jurisdiction for a short period of time. It covers tourists, as I've mentioned. It covers students who are studying abroad. It covers labor migrants. It covers investors, temporary migrants. It covers family reunification. It covers the trafficked, that is, those who have been tricked and forced into movement. And it covers forced migrants and refugees. So it's a soup to nuts, if you will, a coverage of everyone who moves across borders. And the idea of the treaty is that a visitor who's visiting a foreign country for a few days for a business meeting, all he or she really needs is access to the courts if some emergency happened in some way or another. That's the only right that they need. But as you move up that list that I described, for each one of them you need to have more rights and entitlements especially if you're a forced migrant or a refugee. If you're recognized as such, you need to have all the rights of nationals quickly provided. And so you have to have an established gradation getting more rights at each of those different categories. So it distinguishes the particular rights and responsibilities appropriate to each status when individuals move across a border, and it creates a ladder of increasing entitlements based upon the needs of each of these people across each of these categories. What about our methodology? Well, the process was a single text negotiated among a commission of 30 plus experts from around the world. They included very well-known experts. I won't read them all off to you because unless you follow refugee or migration law, they won't necessarily resonate. But a few were an old friend, Alex Olenikov, who was the former deputy head of UNHCR, Francois Crépeau, who was the rapporteur on the rights of migrants, Guy Goodwin Gill, Susan Martin, Joel Trackman, Khalid Kozer, Parvati Nair, Don Kerwin, Tendaye Achume. These are all leading scholars of migration, not all of them, of course, but a few of the leading scholars of migration and refugee studies, all of whom worked together over a couple-year period writing this treaty, which then is designed drawing upon all their different expertises to create that framework of basic law. What was our methodology? We were trying to create a realistic utopia. That is, we were trying to create a world in which we would build a movement toward justice that actually existing but better motivated states could think of signing someday. We have in mind a process that probably won't be complete, if we're lucky, till 2028. So we know that it's not going to be signed tomorrow, needless to say, but we created something that should be signable by responsible states who want to have a coherent and humane framework for the movement of people across borders. That's our aim. So it's no objection to the articles in this treaty if you say they do not correspond to existing treaty commitments or policy. That's not their purpose. It is an objection to the treaty is after you read through it, you think that these articles are not the provisions that should someday govern the movement of people across borders. In a practical way, think of this as a treaty written for a Justin Trudeau. That is, if I had to think of any head of government who might sign this thing, Justin Trudeau, the new Prime Minister of Canada, is perhaps that person. I don't expect that our leaders in Washington are going to sign this at any time soon, nor will the new Prime Minister, Chancellor in Austria, nor many others. But maybe Justin Trudeau. So we need another 40 or 50 Justin Trudeaus, and we might have a treaty. Let me talk about compliance. This is a human rights-oriented treaty. And like most human rights treaties, the question of compliance arises. You know, is this simply hot air put onto print? Or does it have some prospect of actually serving the regulatory function that we had in mind as we wrote it? And this is a serious challenge, as I mentioned, for every human rights treaty. Moreover, like in many human rights treaties, the rights that are established here, especially for refugees and forced migrants, but also labor migrants and others, are protected for individuals whether their countries sign the treaty or not. So that's also a challenge. So how do we expect to get compliance? Well, on the one hand, the biggest winners from this treaty are the vulnerable people who happen to be moving across borders, and the not vulnerable who have advantages in a more stable regime of moving across borders. But these individuals are not in a position to enforce or to ensure the compliance of the treaty. They're the beneficiaries, but they don't have the ability to enforce the compliance. But we do build in some reciprocal benefits into the structure of the treaty, which improve upon what exists in both the 51 Convention and the Migrant Workers Treaty of 1990. For example, Countries hosting refugees. Think of the Lebanon, the Jordans, the Turkeys, the Pakistans, the Kenyas, and many others who host the world's refugees, will, under this regime, benefit from responsibility sharing. We'll no longer just have responsibility by proximity, that is, the country that happens to be next door to where the civil war is taking place, the Lebanon, Jordan, Turkey phenomena. Instead, we'll have genuine responsibility sharing. That is, that they will have access to monies pledged by all countries for the sake of support of refugees, and they'll be able to resettle 10% or so of their refugees who need resettlement. Because we create a mechanism wherein, like a Paris kind of process, the Paris process for climate, each country will be expected, signing this treaty, to show up once a year. UNHCR will identify how many refugees there are and how much they cost, and countries will then be expected to pledge what they will contribute to helping them in terms of both funding and resettling. We're not going to have, there's no global policeman to come enforce that, but this will be a public pledging, as with the activities on climate change, and they will be held to at least nominal account. That is, they'll be embarrassed if they fail to meet their pledge. So there'll be some degree of additional support for better funding coming through here for the countries that are hosting refugees. What about the countries of destination? That is, the countries in particularly destination for resettlement or destination for migrants, the Europeans, North Americans, and others. Well, they all gain laborers, for example, and investors, but laborers and investors are not in short supply. That is, this is a taker's market for laborers coming into North America or into Europe. Same thing for investors. So what do they gain? There's some immediate things that are highly valued in Washington and in Berlin and Paris and London and elsewhere. Will improve the security of our borders. If you join this regime, you make a commitment that all of your citizens, if they travel, will have machine-readable biometric passports. So for the first time, countries will be able to readily know who's in their country. That will be something that's very valuable amongst the wealthier countries who take in immigrants, and that'll be quite useful. Moreover, there are elements of what we call in political science diffuse reciprocity that's built into this. That is, not one-to-one deals, but creating a better structure of rules that allows everyone to profit and flourish. I mentioned the tourist industry, 1.2 billion. There is no regulatory framework underneath it. If there were a regulatory framework, the possibility exists that the numbers might go even further if there were not the kinds of occasional abuses that one saw, and if the tourist industry were encouraged to behave according to a series of patently transparent standards. There might be even more tourism. And tourism is not an insignificant industry. International tourism per se, I'm not talking about domestic tourism, generates $4 trillion with a T dollars in the world economy each year, about 5% of global employment. And so that's a rather significant, and millions of jobs. So if there were a better regulatory framework, there might be higher rates of growth of tourism. Give you another example. Foreign students in the U.S. spend $32 billion each year. $32 billion. They add 400,000 jobs, and so that's a significant impact. Some of the very uncertainty that's been associated with policies in Washington over the past 9 months have actually driven down foreign students applying to American universities, increased the numbers going to Canada. For those of you who read the New York Times, Canadian universities every couple of weeks take a full-page ad. If you're not happy in the United States, come join us in Canada. Now, there's going to be no immediate cure for this, but by having a regime for students, that is, what rights you can claim, what duties you have, what kind of information, what happens if your program collapses, how do you get your money back, all of these things again, a better regulatory framework can allow this to grow even more. And so there are diffuse gains that can be achieved through all of these means. That said, I don't want to suggest that there are hard enough incentives that this will operate the same way the WTO does. That's not the case. Instead, like so many other human rights treaties, and here's where I want to wrap up, it will require, it'll call upon reserves of ethical solidarity. That is, it'll call upon our common decency, our sense of ethical responsibility, and in the background, a bit of naming and shaming. I think we can be inspired, though, by, of all people, William Shakespeare, who thought about a similar problem. This was in 1590. He was called in as a script doctor. Hollywood would describe it, the same way they bring in better writers to improve a lousy movie script. There was a play called The Book of Sir Thomas More. And it was a story of Thomas More, who was confronting rioters in London who were attacking refugees in London. And so he's writing the play in 1590. Thomas More was the Chancellor, the mayor, Lord Mayor of London, 50 years before. Shakespeare then goes to describe and gives us More's speech, condemning and seeking to inspire these rioters to the better angels of their nature. Let me put in a little footnote here for the Shakespeare scholars. What the little passage I'm going to read is the only piece of all of the Shakespeare canon, handwritten, that we now have, whose handwriting matches the historical William Shakespeare of Stratford-on-Avon. So all of those who think that Shakespeare didn't write Shakespeare, this is one of the stronger pieces of evidence that he wrote Shakespeare, if this sounds like Shakespeare to you. So let me read you what Shakespeare has Thomas More saying to the rioters who are rioting against refugees in London. And I quote, "Imagine that you see the wretched strangers, their babies at their backs and their poor luggage, plodding to the ports and coast for transportation." And then I'm skipping a bit. Shakespeare continues, and here I continue from Shakespeare. "What if your monarch were to banish you? Whither would you go? What country, by the nature of your error, should give you harbor? Go you to France or Flanders, to any German province, to Spain or Portugal, nay, and anywhere that not adheres to England? Why, you must needs be strangers. Would you be pleased to find a nation of such barbarous temper that, breaking out in hideous violence, would not afford you an abode on earth? What would you think to be thus used? This is the stranger's case, and this your mountainous inhumanity." So he's saying to these rioters, okay, you're in a privileged, powerful position, you're citizens of London, but imagine if you were being chased out of your country. Would not you want to meet some decent common humanity and be rescued? So that's Shakespeare's message from 1590. And that will have to be part of any element if these kinds of treaties have any weight whatsoever. So let me wrap up. We plan to publish this treaty with commentary in the Journal of Transnational Law in the end of November. If all goes well, we will continue to build support among experts and activists. I've been to Sao Paulo, Paris, London a couple days ago, Boston. I'm here in Salt Lake. I'm going to Vancouver, going to Barcelona, going to Stockholm, all on a sales trip, trying to say to people, give some thought to this treaty. If all we do is publish it, it's going to drop. So we're here to talk to people about it. And my colleagues who are the co-authors of it are talking to other people about the same treaty. If we succeed, we'll get people to pay more attention to it. If they don't like it, they won't sign it. If they sort of like it, they'll sign it, and they'll have reservations, understandings, declarations, the way one does with treaties. And that's fine, too. Our next step is we're going to go to some NGOs. We're going to Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch. If we build support there, we will go to some of the IOs, UNHCR, International Labor Organization, IOM, again, trying to build further support. The value of what we're doing is that we think we've identified a better future regime for migration, one that addresses the sad gaps in that treaty, that displays potential coherence using language that is clear action, rights, and duties oriented the way legal language can. That's our hope and ambition. We hope by displaying what a more coherent, a better regime could look like, one that makes sense and fits together. We want to take away undue concerns that people might have for what kind of regulation the movement of people across borders can sustain. We know these are not sunny times for this endeavor. These are not auspicious times. But on the other hand, if you don't do the work now, when the sun does shine again on issues of global cooperation, you won't be ready. And so we, working with others, are trying to do that at the present time. More practically, we're helping out the colleagues who are working on the Global Compact on Refugees, the Global Compact on Migration. We're doing background work for them. So that's all of our ambitions. In the end, what we'd really like, what our moonshot is, in the back of our minds, our fantasy, is that like the work that was done for the Landmines Treaty by a number of NGOs many years ago, they worked hard. Eventually, the Canadians picked it up. They called a meeting of states, and they assembled enough states to produce a real treaty. A treaty that has 100 and some signatories to it today. I don't need to tell you the U.S., the U.S., Russia, or China, but a lot of signatories. And landmines are in a different world today than they were 20 years ago. So that's our aims. That's what we're looking for. I'd like to pass out, if I could, to you the summary, which you could look at during our Q&A, or Dean? Okay, you can pick it up as you leave. It provides just a summary of the treaty, and at the bottom there's a link that you can type into your browser, which will take you to the home page that has the whole treaty, all 243 articles of it. For the lawyers in the room, I'm sure you can tolerate it. For the regular people in the room, reading a 243 article treaty is a bit demanding, but you can get the substance of it, I hope, enough to be willing to sign it. And so let me stop there and encourage you to do so, and welcome any of your comments or questions. Thank you. Yes, sir.
What a wonderful project that you're working on, and thank you very much for presenting. I'd like to know how your treaty is going to address the growing international blowback that we see happening throughout Europe now. And many other countries about the specific thing you're talking about. People are just rising up and saying, we don't want any more movement. How do you address?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. We can't change people's psyches. What we're trying to do is to create an overall framework that would show the ways in which you could follow rules and have a regime with all the virtues attached to law-abidingness. At the same time, within that framework, other people will need to step forward and persuade people that it is to their advantage to welcome immigrants and refugees. Persuade countries. There was a line from actually the governor of Utah, which I looked up knowing that I was visiting here, and he described a good regime for immigrants as one with a good fence but wide gates. And the virtue of that notion of regime, that metaphor, is one that I like because this treaty is a good fence and wide gates. It affirms the right of every country to choose who comes in. The only human right we have is to leave a country. We have no right to come into a country. Countries have the right to determine who enters their borders. The one qualification that we put to that, as you saw, was for forced migrants coming directly from a conflict, certified by UNHCR, and once we've got full responsibility sharing in place. But for the rest of it, we do not challenge the right of a country to determine who comes into its borders. But what we do say is that there are huge advantages attached to bringing in immigrants in the numbers that you want. For example, the National Academy of Sciences, the National Academy of Engineering, the National Academy of Medicine did a study just last year. And they showed that labor migrants coming into the United States, have no negative impact on U.S. growth rates, employment, or wages. No negative impact. High skill immigrants have a very positive impact. Think of engineers going to Palo Alto or something. They create thousands and thousands of jobs. In terms of the cost that are borne by the United States, the first generation that arrives costs some money. Kids are going to school, they've just arrived, the parents have just arrived, they may need some support, they may need time to educate themselves. The second generation, their kids have a huge net positive impact on the budget. And their grandchildren have an order of magnitude larger impact on the budget. Longitudinal studies in migration. So migration that is within the framework of rules, that is chosen by countries, has a big positive impact. And so for all of that, we need to tell our citizens, try to persuade them, present them with the evidence that a lot of the fears that they now face are the fact that it's out of control, and a treaty like this is designed to provide rights as well as control, and that the flows are beneficial, and that the refugees are not dangerous. That is, that they are amongst the safest members of any society. Notoriously, young Mr. Trump described refugees as a bowl of Skittles that you'd never want to put your hand into, okay? In fact, if you had a choice of 3 bowls of Skittles, and I hate the Skittle metaphor, but let's take it. And the first bowl was refugees, the second bowl was immigrants, and the third bowl was native-born Americans. By far the safest bowl is the refugees, and then the immigrants, and then the native-born Americans in terms of security, in terms of crime rates and things such as that. So we got to talk to our citizens about where the facts are. All that a treaty will do is to create a regulatory regime, and we're better off with rules than with arbitrary, uncoordinated, contradictory principles out there, and that's the case for it. But the persuasion has to take place locally, country by country, assuring them that the only immigrants that come in are the ones they want, but almost all countries have an advantage of bringing in more immigrants. In Germany, I'll stop in a second. In Germany, they don't have net replacement, and so the population is going down. For some towns, that's a very serious problem. I met with the mayor of one of them, and he wrote to the federal government in Germany saying, please send us some refugees and immigrants, because his town was falling to 10% a year. It was going to disappear. And they welcomed them, they integrated them, and it's a very vibrant community. But it's a serious problem. This is not the answer to the global crisis of migration and refugee. It's only part of the answer, is the claim. The lady in the back and then in the front. And I will speak more briefly. I apologize for rattling on so long because that was, to me, a very important question.
Hello, my name is Danielle. I'm a second-year law student here at the University of Utah, and I had a question regarding, it's more of a two-part question. So the first question regards your biometric scanning of refugees. I'm assuming that you'd be using blockchain technology in order to orchestrate that. And my question is would that be monitored by the UN, and how would you keep native countries from utilizing that for human rights abuses? One. And then two, what rights would countries retain as non-signatories and as signatories? My husband is an immigrant. All of his employees are refugees from Burma. And so I'm in favor of having some type of regulatory scheme that exists between states. But my ultimate question is how do you, or what is your plan for incentivizing non-signatory states that aren't neighbors to these states that do have refugees to take on this burden? Thank you.
Okay. On the issue of the passports, that's not just for refugees. Everybody will have a machine-readable passport, as American passports are right now, and they will acquire biometric markers on them. You know, someday they'll put in a code that describes your pupils, you know, your eye pupils, and you'll look into a camera and that'll immediately register you. Or fingerprints. Anyone who has global entry has a machine-readable biometric system of identification. Now, a lot of countries can't afford that, so in the treaty is also built in subsidies so that the countries that can afford it and really want it will help other countries have these passports. And the purpose of that is so that there's a better record of who's in the country and who they are. That's the only purpose behind it. There's other issues about non-signatory countries that might arise, but this is for the countries that signed this convention. They would all agree to do that. And that would be welcomed in Washington and Berlin and Paris and London. I think this lady and this gentleman next.
Okay, thank you for your speech. I'm a second-year undergrad student at Westminster, and I was wondering how you're going to ensure that this treaty isn't going to be, I guess for lack of a better term, hijacked by different governments, different international governments, and even, you know, people in Washington. How are you going to make sure that this treaty stays the way that we signed it to be?
Okay, on this treaty, I would love for governments to sign it because I think it'll provide much better protections and a much better regime for migration. Could it be exploited in one way or another? You know, yes, definitely. This is an ideal model treaty exercise. When it comes down to the, you know, making the sausages of diplomatic negotiations, it'll be a different story. There's no question about it. The Migrant Workers Treaty itself of 1990 was ferociously negotiated by the Europeans, the US, the Japanese, and others in order to minimize the protections built into it. And then they turned around and refused to sign it. So it was a very weak treaty. So all of these things can happen. There's no guarantee against that other than good politics. That is, you mobilize political pressure, and you hope that there's enough of it that you get a reasonable outcome, as they did with the Landmines Treaty. But there are no guarantees. You know, this could be exploited. There's no question. This gentleman, yes. Whichever you'd prefer. Yeah.
In light of the fact that we're living in a post-Malthusian world where the population has exploded in the last 218 years from 1 billion people in 1803 to now approaching 7 billion people. So we have enormous population pressures in many of these countries. Do you think that bringing these migrants into less populated countries actually enables irresponsible reproduction of children that are not cared for and have no means to care for them?
That's not my impression, but you know, as you say, there are some parts of the world where population is still growing very fast. Mostly that's in Africa today, but also in parts of Central Asia. And there are other parts of the world where population is in net decline. Japan, for example, a number of West European countries. The US without immigration would also have declined. And so there is a demographic imbalance, which means that there is going to be not less pressure for people to move, but likely more pressure for people to move as we look in the future. And that's another reason why we need a better regime, so that countries that want labor to come into their countries, in order for that they become and stay prosperous, will have access to them within the framework of the law. And those will provide opportunities for particularly some countries in Africa and elsewhere to release some of the pressure of unemployment that they're facing, and more importantly, bring home remittances to their countries that could significantly contribute to development. Remittances, I think, are a significant multiple of things like foreign aid. I think remittances run at about high 700 million a year, vastly larger than foreign aid, and this could have a very powerful beneficial effect on countries that have those funds coming back to them. So all of that, I think, could be a very good outcome. And in terms of sort of the health of families, I can't think of anything better for a family than having well-employed parents in terms of raising their children. And one could get that from immigrants coming into a country or through remittances going back to a country. And so I think increasing the rate of global economic growth, and migration could contribute to that, would be a significant positive. The demographers say it won't change the overall numbers. We're not shifting the Malthusian balance by moving people from one place to another. They live and die in the same kind of way. But the quality of life of immigrants and of the countries they left could be improved with a good immigration system, in my opinion. Yes, this gentleman. Sorry, I haven't looked in that direction. I'll look to my right in just a moment.
So I just spent the last 2 years of my life working with migrant workers from Sudan and from Mexico and Guatemala and different parts of the world.
Where were they working?
In Washington, in central Washington state. And I was helping with emotional and mental health. And in what ways would this treaty influence emotional and mental health of migrant workers and refugees?
You probably know more about that than I do. It's not my specialty. We had one or two people with medical training who were consulting with us. A wonderful doctor at Columbia School of Physicians named Wafa El Sadra was one of our consultants. She's a great specialist in a variety of different diseases. And there's been a group that does the mental health of refugees who are also in consultation with us. But that's the extent of what we found. My guess would be is that, but you've had the direct experience, but my guess is that if immigrants or refugees were more quickly integrated into an economy, that is, had a job, had their kids in school, that would enhance mental health. Some of the experiences described to us of the immense strains that were on refugees was when they were in a camp setting. That is, that they were put together without work to do, without the dignity of earning for your children, for your family. Those settings are incredibly stressful. Sitting around doing nothing, if you're a healthy adult, is devastating. And so the better integration of refugees and immigrants, the more quickly you get a job, you get your kids in school, I think the better most families would be. Now, some refugees have been traumatized, and they need direct medical assistance, no question about it. That's in the hands of our good medical professionals. But in terms of, to the extent that there are social solutions, I think jobs and education and security, being safe at last, can make a big difference. And unfortunately, if you're an undocumented worker, you're not secure, you don't have a secure job, your future's not secure. If you're a refugee in a camp, again, you're put under immense stress. And those are two things that I would want to see this move us away from. Yes, please.
Okay. I'm a grad student in international affairs, and I have actually two questions. I'm curious about, you mentioned temporary migrant workers, and then kind of like converting them into like permanent migrant workers. So we already have this situation in the Middle East where you see a lot of like South Asian, East Asian workers that have been living there for generations now.
Right.
Like they have sons and then they have kids and whatever.
Yes.
But they never get the equal rights, you
Right.
know, especially like given, for example, in Qatar,
Yeah.
where they're building the new World Cup stadium and all the
kafala
development,
system.
you know,
Yeah.
and they have one of the highest per capita income in Qatar. So how do you how are you thinking of enforcing that? Because these workers that come in and work there probably get like $2 a day or less than that, you know.
Yes.
But a Qatari citizen would be actually is entitled for like over 100,000 per year, like roughly saying.
Right.
So that's my first question. I don't know if you want me to say my second as well or. Okay.
Let me jot that one down, and then you can move to your next one.
My second question is, so I was reading an article in Washington Post, and it said that the world population is projected to go up to 9.7 billion by 2050. So we will keep on having these refugee crises, you know. Don't you think, like, if we attack the cause of, you know, like what creates refugees in your treaty, that would be more beneficial than like just relocating them over and over again, especially like we are at 7.2, 7.3 right now.
Right.
In the next 30 years, we'll be close to 10 billion, you know, which means that we will be having over 1 billion or 1.5 billion people just relocating all the time. So like if you could add some like penalties to states that create refugees, or, you know, like the reasons behind it, what do you think that would help somehow?
Yeah. Good. No, those are both very good questions. You know, with regard to exploited temporary workers, the purpose of this treaty is to make it clear that what's going on in that situation is not acceptable. So it's to send a message. That's the first thing. That is, you can't be a permanent temporary worker. There's a 5-year limit where after 5 years you have to get a right to have the equivalent of a green card in any country in order for you to be compliant. Now, if you ask us how we can enforce that, there's no army that we're going to be sending to any of the Gulf states to enforce it, or anywhere else. That's not part of this system. It's identifying that problem and showing how it should be prohibited is what the treaty does. In terms of whether there would be any pressure not to continue that for, let's call it a scofflaw state that would want to, there will be some pressure. One of the things that we make available as an additional, what we call diffuse reciprocal incentive, is establish a web platform, which is a labor pool. And the countries that are members of this will identify their likely expected needs for jobs that can't be filled by citizens. You can look 10 years out and say, here in the United States, we're still likely to have shortages of agricultural labor, shortages in medicine, and in Palo Alto, shortages of high-tech engineers. We're just not likely to fill that demand because those students are already in the pipeline nationally, so we can predict that. And this goes on to a web platform that is available for application from individuals, recruitment firms, countries that are compliant overall with this treaty. Now, would that be enough of an incentive? You know, there aren't that many Gulf citizens emigrating to Europe or the United States. There are probably some, and so being excluded from it would be a factor. And one also has, you know, investor migrants, which might be something more significant to them, are also part of the treaty that you benefit from if you're compliant, and if you're not, not. But honestly, a state that really is committed to exploiting labor like that is not going to be covered in the sense. There's no enforcement mechanism that creates a world government that goes in and arrests, you know, the leaders that are inflicting this. It's not feasible. It would be a nice world if that were the case. Similarly, with regard to root causes, you know, if we could stop the civil wars around the world with better preventive policies, that would be an amazing big step forward. You know, the refugees that have been driven out of Syria, out of Afghanistan, out of Somalia, are all the product of refugees coming out of civil wars. And when we get to Myanmar, it's a form of ethnic cleansing. If one could clean up the politics around the world, that would be extremely important and would reduce the need to have these humanitarian measures for forced migrants and refugees. That's, so to speak, somebody else's business. That's regard to issues about reforming the United Nations, making it into a more legitimate and more effective structure. That's one factor. The other likely source of refugees is going to be climate change. That is, to the extent that the sea level rises, it puts at risk millions, tens of millions of Bangladeshis, all of whom live within 1 or 2 feet of sea level. It puts at risk some islands, which might completely disappear in the Pacific. So the root cause there is the climate change, and having a much more effective Paris strategy, Paris Plus, would then reduce the likelihood that tens of millions of Bangladeshis might have to flee their country, or that whole nations of islanders from the Pacific would have to flee their country. So all of those root causes are really important. This treaty just deals with a symptom of those root causes, but deals with it in a way that allows some positive net benefits to go back and affect the root causes with better development, remittances, things such as that. I will take them together and answer more briefly. Okay, I will jot them down and respond to them collectively. Sorry.
Hi, thank you. I'm a second year or third year undergraduate student here at the university, and my question is related to internally displaced people. So I was wondering if IDPs have any protection underneath this treaty. I know my understanding is that IDPs are around 43 million people, and with your liberal definition of anyone whose lives are threatened falling under this treaty, I would say with a more liberal definition of migration as well, that IDPs would indeed fall under migrants.
Right.
Thank you.
Okay, good. Thank you. Yes.
I'm a second year student in international studies here at the U, and I was just going to ask, among you and your colleagues, are there any concerns or foreseen complications in the upcoming 10 to 20 year future that could possibly push off your ideal 2028 implementation time?
Yes.
You mentioned the countries of destination having a benefit in terms of resettlement and funds. How is that different from the current system in place for resettlement and funds?
I'm a first-year social work student, and so in your list of 30-plus contributors in the treaty, were any of the contributors providing from that refugee experience? So were refugees involved in your process as you were developing the treaty and sharing their experiences to help inform your work? I want to thank you, Dr. Boyle, for your work. This is fantastic. And then also, I appreciated you sharing about how refugees, especially second and third year generations, the longitudinal studies are showing they have an incredibly positive impact. But you did mention those long-term camps. And in the treaty, is there a strategy for resolving those long-term camps that are now seeing second, third, and fourth year refugees existing in that period because they've been there over 30 plus years? So thank you.
Okay.
I'm a second year student here at the U. First of all, I'd just like to thank you for your work and for your talk. As an immigrant myself, as someone who was removed forcibly, not forcibly, but was removed from their country in times of dire straits, I'd like to thank you for your work. My concern and my question revolves around, you'd mentioned that a lot of the problem, especially in Western Europe, revolves around anti-migrant sentiment that unfortunately comes rather ingrained. How viable or practical do you feel an education system more oriented towards teaching acceptance of migrants might be? How implementable do you think that might be? Thank you.
Great. Thank you for all those questions. They're great. I'd be here for the rest of the evening to answer them adequately, so I'll try to answer them inadequately. On IDPs, our treaty doesn't cover IDPs. From a humanitarian perspective, internally displaced persons have genuine claims. Their lives are at risk. That's why they flee their homes. But from the standpoint of creating a coherent regime for people in moving across borders, they don't fit in. Now, there's also a prudential reason, and that is that people who move across borders are immediately subject to global regulation
and they are accessible, whether as refugees, migrants, or elsewhere. IDPs are inside a sovereign border, so they're not accessible to any degree of international regulation. And they're claimed as a sole matter of national sovereignty. That doesn't mean that from a humanitarian view, we shouldn't have a better regime for IDPs. It's just apples and oranges when it comes to frames of legal protection. So that's why we drew some lines. We don't cover anybody and everybody who's suffering, just people who are moving across borders for the sake of having an overall framework that makes coherent sense and that is interdependent and linked in ways that support each other. And as you know, from the standpoint of real politics, there was an attempt in Istanbul to have a meeting on IDPs 2 years ago, and it produced nothing. So it's an even bigger problem, put it that way. If we could make some progress on refugees and migrants, the next step would be IDPs, because it is a real issue. On the dangers ahead, you know, this has been a really bad year or so for people concerned about international mobility, migrants, and refugees. The people most hostile are in power in many key countries, most recently Austria, the new chancellor there. And so if this were to continue, the negative impressions, the negative narratives about migrants and refugees, and political movements were to win power time and time again, 2028 becomes a pipe dream, basically. There has to be some start of positive movement, of appreciation of the sort that we're hearing from Trudeau, of the sort that we're hearing from Macron in France. Unless that political movement begins to get some traction, this treaty will just say, it'll stay in the hands of academics and in a law journal, and we'll nowhere go out of it. So nobody in the group is Pollyannish or, at this point, optimistic. You know, in the past 2 years, it looked better when we began than it does right now for all the things that we care about. And so the political work needs to be done by people who care about these issues before any regulatory regime has any possibilities. A question then on resettlement and funds, but I didn't get my verb in there. All I got was the two nouns. Yes, please. Could you repeat 1 second?
I was wondering how it differs, the systems that you propose.
System, yes. Okay, every year UNHCR has a pledging meeting that takes place in Geneva, and they asked for support. So what's different here? What's different here is that we increase the stakes quite a bit. We do a little bit of a Paris Plus process. UNHCR here is charged with identifying global need, as they do, and as a starting point, they are in this treaty empowered to use the EU formula on distribution to produce nominal responsibility levels for all the countries that are part of this convention. This is an EU formula that weights up GDP, population, unemployment, past numbers of asylum load, and in a complicated formula calculates what your respective share would be. UNHCR would take that share, apply it to the global load, and then say to countries, here is your share, a number. You can meet it either by funding or by resettlement, but not solely one or the other, some combination of the two. And then they have the choice of pledging, so that's where it's similar to the current one. But then every year UNHCR will report on how countries did. So this is a ramping up of the current system on that. On resettlement, that's part of the formula. So we assume that there would be many more opportunities for resettlement. The other thing that we do, we create this labor pool that I described, where countries identify a future demand for labor. And we get a little bit of a linkage here to the refugee issue because we say you've got to set aside 10% of the prospective visas you plan to offer to resettlement. And there are plenty of skilled people amongst refugees around the world, that could be moved. So that's what we're doing that's somewhat different. But you're right, it already exists. It doesn't go well. The pledging session for the Syrian refugees in the Middle East got less than 40% of what was needed. So that motivates us to try to do something more. But let me emphasize again, until the political work gets done, until we get countries that would be willing to sign a convention like this, having the convention is still an academic exercise. Were refugees involved? A really good question. We sought out refugees. We invited in a group of Syrian refugees into New York, not this past September, but the September before, under the view that they could give us advice on these matters. It didn't work as well as we'd hoped. And the reason being is the Syrian communities identified super smart young people, and they sent us to the meeting we had in New York, co-sponsored with Concordia, which is an organizing group. And they came in and in very eloquent ways denounced the politics of the Europeans and the Americans who were failing to support the opposition in Syria. It's a perfectly legitimate argument to make, but they weren't very helpful to us to helping to design a regime for refugees and migrants. We have discovered an NGO that operates out of New York, which we should have found before. It's run by refugees, and it's called Nothing About Us Without Us. That's the name of the NGO. And they have recently, that is in the past 2 or 3 months, participated in our discussion of what we're doing, and they've actually helped us promote the treaty. But we have not been able to do it. All I would say is that all the people that were in this room have spent their entire careers working with refugees, either in camps or elsewhere, so they knew what they were talking about. But in a better world, we would have had the refugees in the room helping us design this. And when we get to version 2.0, which will be starting next summer, we're going to bring the commission back together. You can be sure there'll be representatives of at least this one really good NGO I know in the room. And that'll be, I think, important. And I also should say that in the treaty, we design in a treaty body mechanism that for the first time will include representatives of refugees and migrants in the discussion and the implementation of the treaty. And that's all described in the last chapter of the treaty. You can see it there. Okay. On the longitudinal impact of refugees, the data that I was citing is all U.S. data. It comes from U.S. records. Elsewhere around the world, different stories depending upon local economies. You can't make exactly the same argument. But there are reasons to believe. There have been studies done by McKinsey in Germany that come up with similar. That is, the first generation are expensive, the second generation and the third more than pay it off. You may know what happened in Washington recently when a document that was issued talked about the costs that refugees impose upon the American economy. In that same document, there was an estimate of how much they contribute within 10 years. If you put together the contribution with the cost, the net was positive, but the administration refused to put in the contribution, so they just issued the cost. So this needs to be carefully planned through, and it'll be different country to country. I'm not sure I've got all of that. But on the education system, it's really important, as I mentioned, that the refugees be educated. That's extremely important. This is a generation, half of whom are 18 or under. If they're not educated, we're going to have a very angry and harmed population out there. How to educate them. The most important way to educate refugees is by other refugees. From many of these civil wars, they've chased out the teachers, they've chased out the professors, they've chased out all the people who could best educate their own citizens, either in camps or a non-camp setting. So they should be employed as the teachers. That's very, very important. What is also important is that our universities get together, and there's something that's being put together in this direction. There are a number of individuals who would greatly benefit from coming to American universities for an education. And there's a Canadian system that brings in scholarship students. And then there's the issue of scholars at risk. That is, there are scholars out of Syria, out of Somalia, and they're highly able scholars who carry with them, the traditions and the culture of their countries. If they are sitting in a refugee camp for the next 20 years, they will not be able to carry forward, the traditions that make their country special, unique, and valued and loved by the citizens. They need to be put in an environment where they can continue to do scholarship. And we at Columbia have accepted a small number, unfortunately a very small number. Other universities are doing the same thing so that these scholars can move from their refuge to continue to do scholarship on Syrian history and Syrian culture and all sorts of different ways. And the same thing applies for other refugee-generating places around the world. That's extremely important. I don't know if I've missed something. If I have, stick up your hand was the question, but if not, yes, please. Sure. Professor Chatterjee is running this.
You mentioned a few things that I think really tie well together. You brought up this idea of politics needing to be the place where we start in order to make these social changes first, so that these individuals have a social structure from which to work with, because that would help relieve a lot of stress for them. If we're looking at this, and this is what I feel, is that you're looking at this from a preventative perspective rather than crisis intervention, so that we have something in place ahead of time. If we're going to influence the politics, then that would mean that we would change the ideology, which requires education. So that goes back to the point that you made regarding trauma. I work in post-traumatic stress and suicide prevention, and I'm curious to know, from a trauma perspective, trauma begets trauma, and we learn, we look at a generational trauma that starts happening. So is there something that can be done as far as this treaty is concerned, even if it's in these camps or something, from a preventative perspective, to address those issues more adequately, so that we can change the trauma, which in turn changes the ideology, which then in turn would affect the perspective on politics, or at least maybe not with the current generation, but a generation that may be coming forward.
Yeah, no, that's extremely important. A treaty is only a pretty abstract set of rules designed to produce more coherence, fewer absurd contradictions, a little bit more coordination. And so the only thing that we have here that would do that is giving the right to access to medical care to refugees without having to wait, which is part of the 51 system. So that doesn't tell what kind you need. That's where the policy comes in. I'd strongly recommend the work that one of my colleagues has done, and I'm sure that there are others working on this. Miriam Rabkin is doing some very important work, again, out of Columbia Medical School with refugees in southern Turkey. And what she and her colleagues are discovering is that we think that the major medical demand comes from trauma, the violence, the rapes that do take place in the context of these civil wars, and it's certainly an issue. What they're discovering is that they forgot all about it in pure therapeutic terms, is that these refugees are still ordinary old people as well, and all of the kinds of either ailments, physical or psychological, that we get every day as a population, they still get. And so you also need all of the ordinary regular therapies that any population of a couple 100,000 in these communities would definitely need. So that's the one thing that she is working on. Not just the traumatic therapy that's needed, but also the ordinary medical care that any population would need. They need too. And that was what was forgotten in some of the UNHCR measures, and so she's working on designing how you put these two things together. And she's on her project is on our website of the Global Policy Initiative, which I direct. I'm sure she's not the only team doing that in the medical community here in the U.S., but it's quite valuable. And she's working hands-on with a series of hosting situations in southern Turkey, some of them in camps, some of them integrated into villages.
Before we end, just one announcement is that food and drink is still there, and also this time for you to wires, you can go also to actually in books section. Handwritten books, they're there for you, and consider all these things. Just want to thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for your questions.
Outside, the summary of the treaty. It's a two-page summary that you can take you to and go through that and log onto the link, the URL, and then like to sign. You can do that. And also, you have quite a few faculty here, and of course, they'll distribute that in their classes to their students. Those who could not come here. It's been streamed too, so many of them are watching.